Good morning, Christ Church. We're thrilled to have you all here, and we're very fortunate to have Professor Yii Jan Lin with us today. We're honored to hear her speak about the origins of the New Testament. The New Testament did not just descend from heaven, bound in leather, translated into English, but it emerged from a turbulent world of tens of thousands of competing handwritten manuscripts, contested ideas, and passionate debates about what stories should shape the Christian faith. How were the decisions made about what we currently know as the New Testament? Professor Yii Jan Lin joins us with an extraordinary academic background, a PhD in New Testament and religious studies from Yale University, an MA in New Testament from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, an MA in English Literature from the University of Chicago, and a BA from Pomona College. Her most recent book, Immigration and Apocalypse, How the Book of Revelation Shaped American Immigration, examines the way the Book of Revelation has informed political rhetoric about America, casting the nation alternately as the New Jerusalem and immigrants, as well as unwelcome, even threatening presence. She's made numerous appearances on radio and podcasts and documentaries to comment on race, immigration, apocalypse, and gender. We're grateful to have her here this morning with us. Please join me in welcoming Professor Yii Jan Lin to Christ Church.
Thank you so much for having me. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So this morning, I'm here to speak on what is the New Testament. And I think the name, the New Testament, is a bit of a misnomer because, first of all, as you know, it's made up of many different books, and each of these books are different in form, right? We have the Gospels, which seem more like a biography, narratives of the life of Jesus. We have the Acts of the Apostles, which is more of a historiography of writing about the life of the church in its earliest days. And then we have epistles, which are letters, right, written on occasion to different areas around the Mediterranean. So these are already different genres. We also have that strange book of Revelation at the very end, which, people have been struggling to make sense of for centuries. So the New Testament is not a monolithic thing by itself that just, is very simple to see and contain, and unified. So it is actually 27 different books. But even within each book and within each genre, there are discussions about what that book entails, what it contains as well, because there are variations in what we have. So I'll explain a little bit more about what that means, but today I'm just going to give you a very broad overview of how we get the translation and the version that you have, that you read when you come to church. You could look it up on Bible Gateway or whatever it is you use online, or whatever copy you have at home. How did we get to that edition? Because it's a long and pretty complex process that leads to what we hold in our hands and what we call the New Testament. I'm not going to get so much into the Hebrew Bible or what we might call the Old Testament today, but just the New Testament alone has a really long history of transmission of that kind of writing, and a long history of how it becomes edited to become the version that you have today. I'm going to use a lot of terms. I'm going to try to be as clear as I can about all of these things, and we'll have a few minutes to discuss afterwards. You can ask me questions. I won't have answers to absolutely everything, but I'll try my best. So first of all, you should know a term called textual criticism. Textual criticism, it's not just criticism of a text. When we're talking about New Testament, textual criticism is a specific area of biblical studies that tries to arrive at a unified edition version of the ancient Greek text of the New Testament. So textual criticism is that area of the field where scholars and experts make these decisions of what goes into your edition, or the Greek edition of the New Testament, and then becomes translated into whatever version you have. So why do we have textual criticism? What are the problems that need to be solved to arrive at a version of the New Testament? Here you see on the screen the portrayal of a medieval scribe. And he is copying, you'll see above him, right, there's a stand that's holding an open book, and then he's writing on parchment himself. So what the open book above is called the exemplar. That's the copy, that's the manuscript from which he is copying. And this is before the printing press, of course. So if you wanted a copy of a book and then you necessarily needed somebody to copy that book by hand in order to produce another copy. You couldn't go and order the book, obviously. You couldn't ask somebody for a scan. It's not going to be reproduced in any of those ways. It's just not possible. And of course, we don't have the printing press. So we needed somebody to hand copy and circulate. So this creates interesting things when you hand copy, right? Think of if I wrote a paragraph or a page of text right now and I handed it to the first person here on the table, and she hand copied that, and we repeated this through every individual to the coffee area, right? By the time we get to that final copy, I am sure we would find variations in that text from what I first wrote down on that page, right? And so this is what's happening all the time, because every copy of every manuscript, piece of literature, Bible or not, is being hand copied at this point. And things happen when you hand copy, right? So the copies that pass through this room and are transmitted are going to be different, probably. You might miss a word, or you might not be able to read my handwriting, or maybe you're really tired and you skip a line, or there's a repeated line and your eye skips to the wrong next line, or you miss out a whole paragraph because you're not paying attention. These things happen oftentimes. Scribes do try really hard. They had a really hard time. Imagine you spend your life copying manuscripts, right? But at the same time, they're also human, right? And they're not machines, or they're not digital printing. It's not happening in an automatic way. So, of course, there's going to be lots of different changes depending on that. And there's also moments where you'll find scribes correcting mistakes of prior scribes. So then that sneaks into a manuscript. Or a scribe thinking, this text doesn't make as much sense as I think it should, so I'm going to change the text intentionally. And that does happen as well. So those sorts of things creep in to the different copies that have come through history that still survive that we have, right? So what New Testament textual criticism and textual critics aim to do traditionally is to establish or try to recover what is sometimes called the original text, right? This is kind of a mythical being of when this first gospel, right, hit paper. Is that possible? We don't know, but that's the purported goal. It tries to determine what happened in the history of transmission when this change came into being and what manuscripts copied that change. So kind of tracing that history of hand copying. So a textual critic would try to take all surviving copies of, let's say, the Gospel of Mark, which is numbering in the thousands, and try to adjudicate among all of those different copies what should be the baseline Greek text from which we create translation. That's a pretty complicated process when you think of the thousands of different Greek manuscripts that we have, and also the kind of work, right, detective work often, of determining what's the best text. And also, that's a theoretical question, right? What does best mean, right? How do we get to a Greek text that we think and agree on that this is what should be what's translated into English? So it's a lot of detective work. So the goals are recovering the original text and trying to determine the history of the transmission of that Greek text and what happened to it in the history of hand copying. So as I've said, some of the detective work is looking at the reality as hand copying. So here's just a general, very simple flowchart of, let's say you have an original text. This is the first version that comes out from an author's hand in their handwriting. And then you have, let's say it gets copied into 3 different copies of it, text A, B, and C, which might have their own variants, maybe mistakes, maybe misspellings, maybe a skipped line, maybe an added line. And then you have somebody copying from text A, so you have text A prime, containing all the different variants, and then maybe some more from text A, right? And this happens to text B, text C, you have more transmission from text C, and then maybe somebody has 2 exemplars, you have text A prime and text B prime, and they're copying from those 2 and comparing them to each other, and now you have text D, which is in textual critic terms, called a contaminated text because it uses more than one exemplar at a time. You can just imagine for the New Testament, and then for each book within the New Testament, this happening in processes over hundreds and hundreds of years. So we get this like massive different texts with different contents in each one of them. So how do you compile that kind of evidence? So I'll just walk you briefly through this. There are general categories scholars use to try to figure out what is the quote-unquote best text. How do we arrive at what was intended? I'll get to the theoretical questions of why that's problematic in a little bit, but generally the wisdom is we want to get to the earliest attainable text. And by doing that, we'll make a few propositions of how to do that. First thing we need to do is compile the evidence, right? To collect all the witnesses, they're called witnesses, right? All the surviving copies that we have. And surviving copies can be broken down into different categories of Greek texts. So in the Greek, we have what is written on papyrus, right? Which is a type of writing material, paper, that's reeds laid on top of each other. And I'll show you a picture of that in just a second. You're probably familiar with that. So these are our oldest witnesses. Written on papyrus. So material is really important also to keep in mind of what things are written on too. This is a different category, so this gets really complicated because the people who made up these categories didn't stick to categories that made sense. So we have material categories, and then we also have handwriting categories. So majuscules, basically called uncials, are written in uppercase script. So all caps, right, thinking about that. So that's one type of writing. Minuscules, as you would imagine, is all writing in lower case. These are different categories for the type of witnesses we have. Then we have a different thing altogether, lectionaries. This is not text of the New Testament. These are church documents in which you have your liturgical readings gathered. And those also serve as evidence. So let's say everything is obliterated and all we have are the copies of the New Testament of this church and the programs that you have. But there are quotations of scripture in your programs, right? That serves as a copy of the New Testament text. So we also have surviving old church documents that keep the readings that a particular community was using. So those are different evidence that's being used of witnesses surviving texts. We also have translations, early translations into Latin, into Syriac, into Coptic, all around the Mediterranean, Northern African world. And then we also have quotations. So if you know any of the early church fathers like Irenaeus, Origen, Clement of Alexandria, these are all thinkers and writers and leaders of faith communities in the early Christian era, and they are writing their thoughts and quoting scripture, and their quotations are also evidence, right? Because those are also pieces of the New Testament text. So just imagine that you're looking at all of this, right? Different materials and types of writing, different kinds of handwriting, uncials, minuscules, different evidence types, like taken from church documents or taken from quotations in church fathers. And then you could try to see the puzzle that they're trying to fit together of what this Greek text should look like, even though you have millions by this point of differences between the different texts that we have. This is P52. It's written on papyrus. It's just a tiny, tiny fragment, really early that we do have. So it's the oldest extant manuscript that we have, around the 2nd to 4th century CE. Now what we have here is John 18, verses 31 to 33. It's written, we see here on the recto. So recto means the smooth, polished side. That's the right-facing side. And then on the verso, that's the left side when you turn the page. That's the rougher side of the papyrus. It has verse 37 to 38 on the verso. Another term you should be familiar with is folio. That also means leaf. So that's the physical page. So a physical page has two sides, the recto and verso, right? So those are words that are used all the time. So this is one of our earliest and oldest extant, so far as I know, at the moment, written on papyrus, again, of strips of reeds growing in the riverbed and mashed together and then writing it on top. It is, so I'll show you where we have the Greek. You can trace it. The verses that we can make out are from John 18. So the Jews say, for us it is not permitted to kill anyone. so that the word of Jesus might be fulfilled, blah, 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 blah. So I've bolded, right, the things that you can make out. So imagine finding this piece, trying to figure out what part of the Bible or New Testament this might be. If you recognize a few keywords, then maybe you can figure out, right, where this fragment is and see where it is. And then you can see, once you figure that out, then you can match what's missing, right, from the Greek into what are torn away from the pages. So a lot of this is very piecemeal and trying to put that together. This is somewhat easier. This is P46. It's part of the Chester Beatty Papyri that's held in Dublin at the Chester Beatty Library. So we have a 3rd to 4th century papyrus. This is quite early also. And it contains, in this collection of papyri, P46, we have most of the Pauline epistles, we have all of Hebrews, and we have that this was found in early 20th century. So even, within the last 100 years, we've had big discoveries of texts that have survived and we just didn't know, or that they were found in different digs or discoveries by accident, or they have popped up somehow on the antiquities market, right, which is another ethical gray area that happens with papyrus. But at any rate, there are new discoveries happening throughout the 20th century that you might think of some famous ones. Chester Beatty Papyri is one of them. Oxyrhynchus Papyri, the Nag Hammadi Library, Dead Sea Scrolls, right? These are all things that have happened in the 20th century, discoveries made in the 20th century, and then inform what other evidence that we have to create a version of the New Testament. So I'm going to go through the 5 great unsealed codices. So just a reminder, an unseal is written in all caps, and a codex, if you don't know, is a book form. So a lot of the papyrus are on scrolls, right? We have fragments. You imagine unrolling a scroll. And that's one way of looking at documents, right? An ancient way of looking. We rarely ever use scrolls anymore, right? But now we use codices. By codex, I mean a book that you open like this, the book form we're used to. And so the codex technology, if we want to call it that, like book technology of opening it up, made it much easier to flip through a book rather than to scroll to the right place, right? It gets pretty tiring to scroll all the way, to Revelation or whatever, if it was continuous. But you can open a codex to a particular place and flip through it in a particular way. So this is layers, right, of parchment, and parchment is animal skin that's been treated and scrubbed and then polished so you can write on it. Quite expensive, as you can imagine, and then bound together into a book form, like we're used to seeing today with paper and board. So then we have, on these great codices that we have surviving, this capital script called unseals or majuscules. So we have 5 very important ones that become a huge part of the evidence we use for creating the Greek New Testament. So don't worry too much about the code-looking things I'm giving you. They're usually the labels that come attached to them for specialists to recognize quickly. They're the symbols that represent them. So there's the Codex Sinaiticus, and I'll go through these in a little bit more detail. Discovered or stolen, just depending on how you view history, in the 1850s. There's the Codex Alexandrinus that was given to Charles I of England. The Codex Vaticanus, which is in the Vatican Library. The Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus, and I'm showing you a picture here. It's called Rescriptus because Rescriptus means written, rewritten. And what that means is somebody, to try to save money, took this Codex Ephraemi and tried to scrub over the animal skin and then wrote over it new stuff. So we have like the faint markings of the New Testament text in that faint blue you see behind it, and then there's the new writing of the new book, because you don't want to buy a whole new parchment codex. It's super expensive, and that's what they were doing. So to them, it was an important witness. It was just, a book that we can reuse for something else. And so here's the Codex Ephraemi. So that's called a palimpsest when you write over it again. So we still have that ghost-like evidence in that, and it's deciphered by Tischendorf, who is also part of Codex Sinaiticus, to see what the text behind there is. And then an important one is Codex Bezae, which was used in the Council of Trent in 1546, taken to Lyon. So there's like stories behind every one of these codices, as you can imagine. These are important objects for faith, for the church communities, for the communities that hold them. As you can see, held in the Vatican Library, or given to royalty, these sorts of things. That these are legendary codexes that still exist, that we still have and can can consult. So this Codex Bezae is held in Cambridge. So let me get to a few more details, and you can see kind of the complexity we're dealing with. Codex Sinaiticus, it is a 4th century codex. Along with Codex Vaticanus, that's held in the Vatican, is one of our most important surviving codices. It was discovered by Tischendorf in St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Peninsula, and there's a whole story about that if you want to read. There's a book called Sisters of Sinai about that monastery, about theft, borrowing, whatever we want to call it at the time in the 19th century. It is believed to have once had both the Greek Old Testament and New Testament, but now it has about half the Greek Old Testament. These books do disintegrate or pages get taken out. It has the entire Apocrypha and the entire New Testament. Importantly, it also contains the Shepherd of Hermas and the Epistle of Barnabas, which are not canonical today. But think about it, if it's included in Codex Sinaiticus, were they at one point considered authoritative, right? And so this is another piece of evidence we have of church history and church life and belief, is the inclusion of books we wouldn't include today. Why are they appearing in Codex Sinaiticus? Good question to ask, right? To think about how that has changed through the years. You can go, there's a Codex Sinaiticus project online if you look for it. So the physical manuscript has been split up, that there's some in Michigan, there's some British Library, so some in Russia, I believe. So there's different, they're all over, but the digital database you can find online, and you can look through all the pages of the Codex Sinaiticus. So if you're curious, and you can also, there's a transcription of it and a translation, so you can find a page of the passage you want and see what it says on the Codex. So the one plus of the digital age, right, is to be able to democratize access to these kinds of things for everybody who can get online. This is the Codex Vaticanus, often considered by New Testament scholars as the best, and I'll put that in quotes, one of the best Greek texts, comparable only to the Codex Sinaiticus. It's also written about the 4th century, written on vellum, again, very fine parchment and cured animal hide, like the Codex Sinaiticus. If you see at the very bottom of the right-hand column, you'll see kata markon, which means according to Mark, and this is the ending of Mark. All right, and so this is the very end. And if you've read through your English version, you'll know that there's actually several endings to Mark, right? You'll have an ending that says the women were afraid, or they were afraid. And then you'll say a longer version of Mark, and it'll tell you what happened afterwards. And then there's an even longer version of Mark, right? So which ending is this? If you see, you'll see the word ephebuntogar, for they were afraid. So what does Vaticanus have? It has the shortest ending. That's one of the earliest evidence we have that suggests the longer endings were added later. It didn't exist when Codex Vaticanus was created, when it was copied, right? This is kind of the detective work that happens then, which is why you'll see oftentimes a little note or little letter that directs you to the bottom footnotes of your Bible, and it'll say, other ancient authorities do not contain, or they have this alternative vision. That's what that means, right? In which this other scroll, this other codex does not have this or does have this. And they're alerting the reader to say, this isn't this isn't the text, there are other texts that exist. Interesting about Codex Vaticanus, of the New Testament, it has the Gospels, it has Acts, Catholic epistles, Pauline epistles. It doesn't have 1st to 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and it does not contain Revelation. And Revelation in and of itself is a strange book that kind of comes in and out of being included, because you might be able to guess why. I mean, it is a problematic book. We don't quite know what to do with it. There are interpreters of it through the centuries that felt like it shouldn't be canonical, it shouldn't be included for various reasons. But it is part of the Christian canon today generally. This you can also find the digitized facsimile online, so reproduction of the digital images of the Vaticanus. This, Codex Bezae, is a 5th century manuscript, and it's interesting. It's often called a Western text, although that's kind of dying away, because it has lots of readings that are very strange. And it's also different than what you might find in Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. It's part of what's categorized as the Western family. That's, again, going away, but it even has a different order of books. So if you look at the bottom, it'll say Evangelion kata Johannein, the gospel according to John. entesleste, it's at the end, it's ended, right? So the end of the Gospel of John, followed immediately by archetai, the beginning of Evangelion kata Lukan, the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. Does that strike you as strange when you go from John to Luke? Aren't we used to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, right? So this is a Western ordering. If you look at a group of Western texts, they have this ordering instead of the ordering we're used to in our Bibles today, right? That's another difference, is the order of the New Testament books and how they appear. And so they get grouped together, kind of like if you were to taxonomize species, this species of text has this order of it in it, and that's why they're grouped together and called Western. So their order is Matthew, John, Luke, and Mark, which is quite different than what we're used to. And they're found in some other manuscripts, as well as some translations that are in Latin and also in Gothic. So this is kind of giving you a snapshot of some of the most important pieces of evidence that we have. So we've surveyed 5 of the most important codices. We've talked about the categories of the different sources. There are thousands, over 25,000 surviving manuscripts, if we're not just counting the Greek sources, but translations and lectionaries, again, church documents and quotations. And each one of those handwritten manuscripts has variations in those readings. And not one of those texts is identical to another text, right? So this creates a huge amount of problems you can think of for the editor of who's gonna print the Greek text. What is the Greek text? What is the New Testament? We have thousands of New Testaments. All of them are different, maybe in small places, but some of them have pretty significant variation. So the questions are then, how do we produce an edition of the Greek New Testament? What should be printed as that baseline text that everyone then translates from? When we reference an ancient audience, people in Galilee were reading this, what were they reading? Right? We may not have the text that they were accessing. It might be very different from Alexandria or different parts of the Mediterranean or Asia Minor. Those texts have geographical differences as well from each other because they spread in different areas and changed as they circulated amongst different scribes, right? So you can imagine that not every community was reading the same text. What do we mean by the New Testament? It's not a unified, identical thing across the world and across time. And then which text has spiritual authority, right? And these are the theological questions you could ask about textual criticism. What does it mean that we have such a variety? And then also, for those who are curious about this history, if we look at certain significant changes to the text at 2nd century, 3rd century, in this area or that area, can it tell us something about the history of those people there and why they changed it in a particular way, or why this passage was added, right? So that's a lot of intriguing possibilities that we have when we look at differences between the variations in the text that we have. So there's been a huge search for the original text to try to take on this project and create, a text as close as possible to when, pen hit paper, if that's possible. And the way that people do that, I'll split them into 2 groups. The first is what's called external evidence. This is evidence that's not the content of the text, but stuff around the text. So for example, what's the date of the manuscript? And I don't mean the text written in the manuscript, I mean the date of the vellum or the papyri or the embellishment on the cover. That'll tell you something about at what point this was written on. So that's one piece of external evidence. Is this a Western text ordering? Does it look like other texts from Asia Minor? That's another part of external evidence. Also to see where it's coming from. Is it more like texts, in North Africa? Is it more like texts going in the Western Latin tradition out from Italy and beyond? And can we determine some sort of family tree, right? Can we say, this text had this one weird passage added, and then everything else afterwards in Italy, or whatever, I'm just making this up, but has this weird text. So maybe this text, which is older seeming from this manuscript, is the ancestor of these particular texts copied in that area. Right? I hope that makes sense. So you can try to reconstruct that transmission history. There's also internal evidence, which is the stuff the text actually says, like when you read it. So, for example, you can try to get to an original text by getting rid of all clear mistakes. This is a misspelling. We're going to get rid of it in our Greek edition, right? Or this is a repeated line, obviously a mistake. So those are easy. Those are, this is a nonsensical reading. It doesn't make, this scribe was falling asleep. Or like they couldn't read the text and so they just made something up. Those are some interesting, not that interesting mistakes that you can get away, take out and say, okay, we don't need to include this. There's also something called the lectio brevior, which is if you have two different variants, the shorter one is preferred. So to explain that, I would say it's more likely that a scribe would add to a text to try to explain it or to give more meaning to it or more depth to it than a scribe would take away something from what is considered sacred scripture. So that is one principle that textual critics might follow when they're trying to decide which one was the original verse. Did this one come earlier or this one come earlier? This one is long and verbose and seems like someone is trying to explain a difficult passage. So we're going to assume that the shorter one is actually the original, as versus the scribe just taking away all this information, which you wouldn't do lightly if you were supposed to be copying faithfully, right? So you see how that argument goes. There's a similar argument called lectio difficilior, which is the more difficult reading is the one that we'll accept. So, for example, if it says, Jesus became angry, and then later it says, Jesus was shown to be merciful, the more difficult reading, in most scholars' view, is that Jesus is angry, right? We're seeing something that is more harsh, less, nice feeling, cozy, right? And it could be more understood as the scribe is more likely to smooth that out rather than create a more difficult reading for the next reader or the next community. Of course, these are always true until they're not, right? So we don't know, we can't falsify that, but you see the way the argument goes, right? If it says Jesus is the son of Satan, and then that gets changed to Jesus is the son of God, you gotta think like, what is this? The scribe is more likely to make this a palatable reading, a reading that is theologically in line, right, than something that's not. And you can actually see these changes if you look at your own Gospels. If you look at the Gospel of Mark, which then parts of it are quoted verbatim in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. And Matthew and Luke oftentimes smooth over Mark. Right? Matthew makes Jesus a much gentler, kinder Savior than we find in Mark. And that's one form of editing that we find. And that's the kind of argument that's textual critics are following to say, well, generally, we would say the shorter is better, or the more difficult is better, more likely to be what was there in the first place before scribe went and massaged it a little bit to make it read better. We also look at the style and vocabulary of the author. If Paul is suddenly saying something that uses vocabulary he doesn't usually use, or if he suddenly is talking about women praying in church, this is in 1 Corinthians, talking about women praying in church, and what they're doing in service, and then all of a sudden it says, I do not permit a woman to speak. It seems like I didn't follow the argument very well. Like, is that an interpolation? Is it because somebody later was like, this is not acceptable, and we're going to add that verse in? That argument is actually made, that verse is not Paul and was added later to that particular passage, because everything else that Paul's writing about seems consistent to having women pray, women prophesy, women being in the church congregation and absolutely speaking, right? So then why does this verse show up? So then we also take note of the style and vocabulary of the author. So what all this looks like, if you get a Greek edition of the New Testament, this is the Nestle Aland Greek New Testament edition number 28, you'll see something like this. This is the first double-page spread of the Gospel according to Mark, Kata Markan. And you'll have the baseline text, and it's riddled with footnotes, sigla, all sorts of things. It'll note all the comparable, quoted, alluded to Old Testament texts on the sides of the margins. And then all the different sigla, the signs that you'll find in the apparatus. That's the big chunk of text on the bottom. And what that will tell you is where variant readings occur throughout. So if it'll tell you, so it'll say, like, for example, verse 1, 2, 3, you'll say, okay, these things are missing or these things are added in these manuscripts, right? So then you can check the apparatus at any point and see what the difference is in which manuscripts. It's very complicated. You kind of have to decode because they use a lot of symbols and they give you a little pamphlet. But it's basically trying to give you everything to You can make your own decision if you look at the bottom and see, actually, I think this reading is very interesting, what codices or what manuscripts, what witnesses contain this different reading as versus what's printed in the baseline text. But it's trying to arrive at a baseline text as far as possible. And it's called the eclectic text because it chooses what textual scholars have considered the best text out of all the manuscripts that we have. So what is printed in the baseline text does not actually exist in any surviving manuscript. It's a zombie text, right? It's taking all the readings from all the evidence we have and choosing, eclectic, right, chosen, right? Choosing out of those and putting it together. So this text doesn't actually exist. It's just the best guess of what the original reading is from textual scholars. And so that's what's appearing in the Nestle Aland 28. So there's baseline text. We have intertext, right? We have allusions to, quotations of, and then we have the symbols, right, pointing to. Oftentimes that little circle is like this is missing something. So indicating variant readings and the apparatus, so showing the sources for the different variants. In the time remaining, I'm just going to give you 2 examples of some couple significant variants. You should know that significant, important, meaning-changing variants are rare. It's not as if we're holding something that's completely contestable and everything is different. That's not the case. So in fact, the vast majority of variants, like 95% of the changes, the differences in the manuscripts are just obvious mistakes, right? So there's like misspellings or skipping lines from the scribes, those sorts of things. Those are the vast majority of variants that we have. But there are some significant ones that change things. So we're going to look at 2 of them. The first one is from Mark chapter 1. So this is verse 39. He went through Galilee, this is Jesus, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. A leper came to him, begging him, kneeling. He said to him, "If you choose, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I do choose, be made clean." So this is one reading that we have in Mark. This is reading B. He went through Galilee proclaiming the message. Moved with anger, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I do choose, be made clean." This is not a spelling mistake or an elision or something because the Greek is quite different, right? Splachniste and orgistes are different and look different. So it's a very significant variant that talks about the emotional life of Jesus at this point of healing, right? So what do we do with this? These are the readings for reading A. We have them in Codex Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, Claromontanus, some other versions, right, the Sahidic, the Bohairic. Reading B, we have, on the other hand, Codex Bezae, A, Family 2, all these other manuscripts as well, right? Different codices, etc. How do you choose, right? What do you make of these different readings? And if you're an editor for the Nestle Aland, what are you going to do, right? So that's the question that confronts these kind of editors is, do we put angry or do we put pity in the baseline text, which then gets translated? Of course, you can always add a footnote, right, to say other ancient authorities read, add anger with pity. But what you put in the baseline text often becomes theologically authoritative, and that's usually what a preacher, what a scholar will first see and consult upon reading the text. So it's a very important theological decision often that textual critics are being made to choose, right, when they print this. And you could decide, okay, we usually go with Sinaiticus and Vaticanus for a vast majority because the age and the quality of those codices. But if you go by the principles, being moved with anger is a very difficult reading as opposed to being moved with pity, right? The more difficult reading seems more likely to have been what was there before a scribe said, "This doesn't make any sense. I'm going to change it to pity." It's much less likely, if we want to make that argument, for a scribe to say, "He says moved with pity, but I think he was moved by anger, and I'm going to change it," right? So how do you make that kind of decision? Here is another one, it's Matthew 27. We have reading A. At once one of them ran and got a sponge. Jesus is on the cross in the passion scene. It filled it with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink. And the other said, "Well, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." This is a really important passage. This is read in liturgies. We're going to read it on Good Friday. Important theologically, thinking about Jesus' last words, Jesus' last scenes on earth. Reading B, so same thing. Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. and another took a spear and pierced his side, and out came blood and water. So that is not in reading A, but it is in reading B. Quite significant, right? So what is happening here? Well, we have an entire other sentence with symbolic meaning, loaded meaning, in a very important passage of Jesus' life. So again, you can look at external evidence. These are the manuscripts that have reading A as versus the readings that that add this particular sentence, Codex Sinaiticus Vaticanus and Ephraemi Rescriptus. You can decide based on the age of these different manuscripts, how trustworthy scholars think they are, how far spread they are geographically, all those sorts of things to make that decision. But it becomes a really important decision when it gets to the Greek version of what you have. So oftentimes you'll see, again, those notes that are trying to alert the reader, this isn't the end of the story. There are other ancient manuscripts that include different things. So for example, the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8 is not included in many ancient manuscripts. So it'll have a bracket around it. But you'll notice it's printed in the mainline text in your English version. And it is also printed in the mainline text in the Nestle Aland. And I asked one of the editors why it is included and not shunted to the apparatus. And their answer was, because it is such a beloved tradition. So it's really interesting to see how tradition is as much a driving force of interpreting and doing the work of textual criticism and what gets put in the baseline text, along with the more technological, calculative aspects of adjudicating between these texts as well. So the fact that that is a beloved transmitted text, part of John chapter 8, is included, even though it does signal with brackets that it's not included in many of the ancient manuscripts. I'm not going into all the details of this, but you'll imagine that computer software has changed this world quite a bit and made possibilities that weren't available when we had the NRSV first created and all of those things, right, and other translations from versions. So now, instead of just collating stuff and making poor grad students do the work for researchers, now we use computers, right, and we can run transcriptions. Once they're transcribed, we can run them into analysis and create this gigantic, complex, scary-looking tree of texts or a global map of networks that show possible relationship and changes. So the coherence-based genealogical method, I'm not going to go into it, but it's just basically trying to take all transcriptions, comparing all Greek continuous manuscripts at every point of variation to arrive at some baseline form. And that is actually now what the Nestle Aland newest editions are based on. And that is what further translations going into the future will be working with. So technology, thinking about these things, statistics, individual human choices as well along the way, create this mass of this. So I'm gonna stop there because that was a ton of information. But just to show you like the endeavor to create this Greek New Testament text. We haven't even touched canonicity, right, which is a whole long history in and of itself, or the work of translation, which is also contested of how do you translate from language to language. It often doesn't have a one-to-one ratio, as you know if you know different languages. And so this is part of the massive decision-making, human theories about what happened to the transmission of the text, and also theological problems that get faced when we talk about original text. Is older always better? Is the one that the author first wrote as versus what is passed through tradition, is that always going to be better? And that's a theological choice as well, or authoritative choice, to say, do we think this is a more authoritative text that we should follow as versus something later? But that's the opposite of what you would say if you say, that's my final draft as versus my first draft, right? So like, how do we make decisions about what has authority? And where do we go as communities of faith and scholars and all of everyone who's interested in sacred texts go to in this long line of transmission? So I'll stop there and take some questions.
Well, that was great. That was great. I must confess, when I hear you, and I loved your Bible study on Revelation, that it makes me in my one-day retirement think, I want to go back and get a second seminary degree, because things have changed and we've learned so much. Yeah. It's incredible. Questions? Jeffrey.
Two pretty basic questions. First of all, the people that are scribes that are going over this, are they all church people? Are most of these documents coming from monasteries and ancient churches, or is there a bigger source than that? And the King James Version of the Bible, is that based on some specific text that you could refer to? And the other question is, paper was invented in China around 100 BC and maybe a little after that. How long did it take to get to the monasteries and churches in Europe that you're talking about? Thank you.
Those are great questions. Trying to remember the very first one now.
Most of these documents were in monasteries?
Oh, right. Yes. So yes, most scribes are working as monks in a monastery in what's called a scriptorium, in which their basic task was to copy. You could also have, and there's also a long history of enslavement, which is unfortunate, right, and tragic for early Christian movements that were part of the church. It was part of the general ancient economy in which you could have an enslaved person copy a text as well, if you were a wealthy household and you wanted a text. But generally there are scribes within churches who are copying, and that's generally the gathering of that. I think there are individual, we don't know, there are individual scribal decisions that are happening on the ground. I don't know the exact answer to this. There are overseers of scriptoria that would be making sure that the scribes are doing their job. For the most part, they're trying to be as faithful as they can, but we do find changes. We're not quite sure why, right? We don't have the evidence of, was this a top-down decision? Was the scribe making their own? We do have funny things like doodles, and so we know scribes or like they're falling asleep, or they're writing little poems on the side, or they're making little, drawings of, mice or whatever in there, like through the centuries of scribes having their own personalities and doing their own thing. So that happens as well. Your other questions? Oh, King James, right? You also. Paper, I don't know at that point when it entered Europe, but we do have parchment quite late. So I would say many centuries. I don't know if anyone knows that history of when it reached Europe, but we are still using vellum quite late, I think, into medieval periods. So the King James is an interesting text because it is based on what is called the majority text. So majority text is the Byzantine text. So after Constantine, you have a standardization of text, basically, right? So because you have the religion of the empire now, that becomes important. And so you begin to have a text that looks quite the same throughout. It becomes dominant within. And so most of the manuscripts we have, that's why it's called the majority text. But just because it's the majority doesn't mean it's the best, right? It just happened to come into power. You can think of it, and people have compared it to Darwinian evolution. It's the dominant species, right? It came because it has power behind it as authority within post-Constantine world and Christian empire. So the King James is based on that and what's called the Textus Receptus, the received text. And there's a whole long history of that being seen as, because it was given that title, the received text, kind of casually by the people who created that edition, it became seen as the holy text that cannot be changed. But it's actually based on very little of the manuscripts that are quite ancient that we have now. So it doesn't include those ancient authorities because we didn't have those texts or they weren't discovered. And in fact, some of it is quite questionable because we just lack. So there's a story of, I'm going to get this wrong, but Erasmus copying or creating the Greek edition of the end of Revelation, and he didn't have the Greek manuscript for the end of Revelation. So what he did is he took the Vulgate, Latin Vulgate, and back translated it into Greek. So it's not necessarily based on ancient authority, but that then got translated into the King James. So as you know, the King James and then the received text in Greek has been vaunted as the one that we need to use. But that was a huge battle, especially in England, in the 1700s, 1800s, to say, no, we have all these other evidence, and we're going to publish a different Greek edition. That was quite controversial to do that, because you were going against the received text, so yeah.
Thank you. Fascinating. Thank you very much. I wondered if there's a way of just generally aggregating the key themes that create the difference of the 5%. You mentioned the emotions of Jesus, maybe the character of Jesus. You mentioned the role of women. Are there, in that 5%, any 2 or 3 big themes that are different?
So what you're asking is thematic differences, categories, right? I would think more in terms of, and textual critics would think more of types of differences, like name changes or additions or elisions or those sorts of things. I don't know that we necessarily can group them into thematic categories. I would say, though, we do have quite a lot of variation within the sayings of Jesus. And there's a scholar named David Parker. He's written the living text of the Gospels. And his argument is that there are a lot of changes amongst the sayings of Jesus because they're the most important. They're the most debated because they hold the most weight for many faith communities through the centuries. So, for example, the sayings of divorce and remarriage, huge amount of variance because it was difficult for communities to think about, right? And so there's a way that might cause theological anxiety, but Parker would say, actually, it shows that Scripture is changing with human communities, and it could be seen as tradition being as powerful as, and that the Spirit can also be inspiring tradition as well as inspiring Scripture at the beginning of its writing. So I think there's quite a lot to say. Like those difficult passages, I would say, often attract variance is one way to think about it. Yeah, the thing about women is part of it, but there are other things, Jewishness of Jesus or early communities. There's like anti-Judaizing, supposedly in Codex Bezae, where there's a scribal tendency to kind of smooth away what's more Jewish. That's definitely seen as part of like a particular codex leaning in the way that does that. So yeah, I would say broadly, maybe those things. Yeah.
As you articulated very well, along the centuries, many conflicting variants were aroused. So the reason for these conflict variants were personal, political, or aimed to find a spiritual truth. And how did it change historically one way or another?
We don't know. Again, like this is very hard, and what we can try to argue, we might already see in other parts of history, right? So, for example, Bar Ehrman has written The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, and that book basically argues that a lot of the variants we see in the Gospels are around debates about Jesus' Christology. And that was happening around 3rd, 4th century, right? Heading up to our creed of, fully God, fully man. And so we have a lot of variants. But many people would say, sure, we can argue about the variants, but you already knew that was happening because of the other history evidence that we have. So which came first, chicken or the egg? Like, are you reading the history into the variants that we have? You can't falsify it because we can't go back and ask the scribes why they did it. It's just a guess to say, we can see, because we know this about the history, maybe these variants are based on the debates that were happening at that time. So it's just our best guess of what we already know also about the history of the church and Christianity as well.
Just picking up on that reference to best guess, I'm curious as to the application today of technology in doing everything that you've been talking about.
Yeah.
And the ability of technology to absorb millions of bits of information in a short period of time, compare and contrast, find the variances. How has this changed all of what you've been talking about in the last year or two or three?
Yeah, so up until, I don't know, early, maybe 21st century, maybe 2010, possibly 2005, we were creating profiles of different text families. So we'd say the Western text has these peculiar readings, and the Alexandrian text would have these, and we had these text families. Then we would then collate, some significant text in there and have a profile. So it was kind of like, these are stereotypes of these kinds of texts, and then that's how we think about them. But we don't have to do that anymore, because now we have comprehensive software that can go through all of them. So we don't have to create stereotypes. We can just create, we can just gather all the data through software. And so instead, what they do is they create transcriptions, and they're able to feed those transcriptions into software, and then and then also decide what the parameters of what a variation is. And then at every point of variation, it can show all of them within the evidence. And then a textual critic will decide, was it A or B or whatever, which came earlier or later, the textual flow, which they think came earlier or later. And then once they've input all, so there's still human input. It's not decided by software. So there's still human input. But after that's input, in the comprehensive level, then it can create something like that, right? So then you have a general flow. And from that general flow, statistically, you can say, this would be the best text. So it's different because it's the difference. And I compare it, and I wrote a book called The Erotic Life of Manuscripts, saying it, because they're talking about species as if they're reproducing, right? So it's like going from Linnaeus's taxonomy of this is, what you learn in grade school, like this is a bird, this is a reptile, this is, to what we do in genetic evolutionary biology today, which is we can create a tree of life that looks at DNA on a comprehensive level, that doesn't go through, reptile, bird. It doesn't separate into those things. Instead, we can see that the dinosaurs were much more related to birds than they were, and these categories no longer are discrete. So I think that's the big difference, is that we can create something like this and not have these separate, different species that we then compare. So yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to know, you talk about all the ways that, the Bible has been changed, the New Testament and whatnot. Have you ever done any research on whether the translation verbally to people, because obviously people weren't educated at that point, and it was what was taught to them. And when I was brought up in the Catholic Church, we didn't do any Bible study at all. So what we were learning, when they were reading the epistle, was all the interpretation, basically, to a certain extent, when the priest would talk about them, or back then when the scribes were talking, were their interpretation. Is there any research into wondering if verbally things came down and they were told wrong or whatever? I mean, this is, for me, as I said, being raised in the Catholic Church, that the Testaments, the Bible, are, basically Greek to me. Excuse the expression. But that's what I was just wondering.
Sure.
Are you getting verbal? Have you ever checked into the verbal way of the just, what the scribes and the priests have done?
Right. So oftentimes it will seem maybe a scribe is used to hearing this liturgically in a different way, and so not necessarily copying the exemplar. And we've all done this, right? You're praying the Lord's Prayer in a different way than the church is praying it, but the way you've memorized it comes first, right? So maybe a scribe is doing that, or someone who's copying a text is writing what they know from memory, but it doesn't actually match the text they were copying. So we do have possible evidence of that. Of course, we don't know, but sometimes it seems likelier than not. So those things that are often used the most in ritual, in liturgy, Lord's Supper, baptism, those sorts of things are most likely candidates when we see something like that, for something that's been memorized or heard orally in a particular way, right? To have that be different than another text, because memory is working in a different way than reading at that moment, right? So if you memorize it a particular way, that's the way that you're going to rewrite it, most likely. Yeah, but we can't, of course, it's hard to falsify. We just don't, we can't go back in history and hear or know. So that's sometimes we might have some evidence for that, but oftentimes we can't know for sure that that's happening, but it's a very possibility, yeah.
Would you close by just giving us an example of some translation that's affected history enormously, that, for instance, calling Mary a virgin or a young woman?
Yeah.
What text or word or something comes to you that has altered church history a great deal?
Well, that's a great question. I think one that we think about more recently in 20th to 21st century is the word servant, that's the translation of what is slave. And so that, may be a very nice euphemism to think about in the first century, but it's often doulos, it's enslaved person, right? And so to have enslaved people being used in metaphors and stories all the time, they're just part of everyday life in early Mediterranean world. And we kind of erase that, or we don't want to talk about a difficult and tragic history, right? Not only in the first century, but also, of course, in the slave trade in more recent history. So I think that's a big one that people are grappling with now in translations. The NRSV updated edition, I think, grappled with that a lot in thinking about how do we translate different parts of Scripture. And should we ever say servant or should it say enslaved is up to debate as well. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. This has been incredibly stimulating. We appreciate
Thank you so much.
your teaching and your life's dedication to this work. God bless you.
Thank
Thank
you
you all
for
for
having
being
me.
out
Thank
here.
you for having me.